Hello and welcome to this next edition of the Value Exchange. I'm Annabelle Lambert and I'm here with my regular co-host Rob Pye. Say hello, Rob Pye.
Aletta, Annabelle, hello.
And as Rob has just intimated, we are very excited to be with Aletta Venter today, who is by profession an agroecological farmer, normally based in South Africa. We have met her through our Valley of Grace project, but is currently seated on the west coast or near the west coast of the USA. So Aletta, welcome, and please do tell us a bit about yourself, and we will pile in with lots of questions. So where did it all begin?
Yeah, so hello. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Where did it all begin? Well, it definitely began in South Africa, and I was born in 1961, so I really grew up in the height of the apartheid era in South Africa. My father was a political journalist, editor, and so as a child, I was inundated with the politics of the time. And so by the time I got to leave the house, my main objective was to escape any form of politics. And in fact, humans, because I was so horrendously disgusted by what was going on. And so the furthest away I could get from that was actually to throw myself into trying firstly to become a vet, which I didn't at first succeed in. And the next step was to go into farming. And I was like, well, that can get me as far away as possible from the sort of, regime of apartheid. And so I qualified as a conventional farmer and did various things. But eventually I was sort of trying to find my way into farming, only to discover that as a woman, a white woman in South Africa, even at that time, the only way I was going to farm was actually to marry a farmer. And I was like, no, that's really not going to happen. But eventually I did manage to find an entry through technology, actually. And so I've always had an interest in the sort of interface between working on the land and utilizing technology. And anyhow, as things went on, I eventually ended up in New Zealand and met up with biodynamic agriculture there. And that really set my life journey on a different course. And so I returned to South Africa in 2002, having met the biodynamic agriculture in New Zealand. And already at that point, we had this family farm which my father had purchased at his retirement in 1995. He was given a golden handshake, and so he had the capital to be able to actually buy a farm cash. And in the wisdom of the time, from where it was coming from, he put the land into a family trust. That was like the common thing that one did at the time in South Africa. And so the trustees at that time were basically my parents and myself and my siblings, and then the beneficiaries would have been my parents' grandchildren. So that included my son and my brother and my sister's children's. And so that was the status of the farm. And I and my late partner did actually farm there from between 95 and 99, the end of 99, as conventional farmers. And that kind of came to a sticky end due to conflict between family interests, because the family, on the one hand, had certain ideas and my partner, myself, had other ideas. So that was my first sort of taste of the challenges of really being on the land. And that we decided to address that by actually leaving the farm temporarily. And we went off first to Ireland and then to New Zealand as contract workers. And that was also a very interesting sort of experience for me in New Zealand. I, for the first time, really actually felt what it was like to be just a laborer on a farm. and to be dealt with as an object, not as a human being. And I was like, okay, I understand now why there is such huge hatred on the land in South Africa with the farm workers who were being treated in that way by the so-called, farm, what people generally think are the farmers, but they're actually just the landowners or managers. They're not the people that's actually working the land. So when I'm talking now about farmers, I actually always refer to the people that are really actually doing the work on the land. And that's very distinct, as I said, from the people that own the land. Or yeah.
Yeah.
Anyhow, so on my return, I then engaged. I was very captivated by the idea of biodynamic farming, and I'm not sure to what extent people know what biodynamic farming is about. It's an approach to farming that is based on spiritual science, which is a field of knowledge that was developed by an Austrian philosopher called Rudolf Steiner. And he's perhaps better known in the world for Waldorf education, perhaps. But yeah, I then embarked on this journey, and I was very surprised actually to find that there was a movement for biodynamic agriculture in South Africa. And one of the founders of that movement was literally across the mountain from me, 35 kilometers away. So I was very privileged to then have her as a mentor for 7 years. And she really guided me into this field. And it's a journey of personal discovery, really. It's I always like to say that one doesn't find biodynamic farms so much as you find biodynamic farmers, because it really starts from the human being. So even though at that point I was still very much orientated towards just working with the land and the plants and the animals, I didn't want to have anything to do with people per se. Of course, starting my journey in biodynamics quickly made me realize, well, in fact, the center of it is the human being. And my mentor, Jean, often said to me, because I was like, all I want to do is milk cows. I'm really not interested in anything else. She said to me, listen, you know how to milk cows. This is not what this journey, this lifetime is about. It's about how to find people that really want to connect to the land. And so, yeah, so that journey started in 2002. That's how many years ago? 22 years ago. And it's been a steep learning curve, and it's brought me now to the point where, in fact, I sort of semi-retired from active farming 2 years ago, and my mission now is to truly really bring the land trust that we've created in the meantime into realization. And that is proving to be much more difficult than I ever envisaged. So, yeah, I'm jumping around a bit, but to get back to this land trust, because as I said, my father initially put the land into a family trust, which is a very standard legal arrangement. In this early period of discovery of biodynamic agriculture, one of the key tenets there is that land is not a commodity. It is not something that ought to be traded as a commodity. Land should not actually be for sale. And that really captivated my attention early on. So that even by about 2005, I remember drafting a one-page. I very rarely get beyond one page. My father being a journalist, this was like short and sweet. So I wrote this little one-pager, putting forward the idea of taking land out of private ownership and putting it into a land trust, and then making the opportunity available to whoever wants to connect to the land and bring it to health and productivity, supporting them with sufficient resources to make that happen, and to really remove all barriers, like the barrier that I was experiencing, that I would never, as a white woman in South Africa, actually gain access to land because I didn't come from a farming family, I wanted to remove those barriers for people. And of course, by then, we had already had the first free election, and the whole idea of land reform and, sort of addressing the injustices of the past was, of course, very high on the agenda. And I became quite involved with one or two NGOs that were working in that field. And so my ideas around doing land reform in a different way was starting to germinate at that point. And so I had this little one pager about my dream of putting land into a land trust and enabling young people from any walk of life to gain access to land to be able to farm. And of course, that in a sustainable way, that would be agroecologically sound. But nothing much kind of was happening because it was early days. But so I returned to South Africa in 2002. By 2005, 2006, I was developing those ideas. And then in 2012, my destiny kind of knocked at my door by a phone call. I was phoning my dad to say, you know what, there's this new legislation of Fika, Rika, whatever, for the trust administrator, because I was the administrator of the trust. And the family had given me a veto right on the trust, in terms of selling the land, because I was the only family member that was really interested in the land. So they said, oh, okay, fine. So if we ever get to the point of talking about selling the land or anything like that, you have the veto right. So that was like in my pocket at the time. Phoned my dad. I was like, oh, we need these papers and we have to do this. And it's, it was quite a mission. And my dad at that time was no longer living on the farm. He was in Port Elizabeth. And he said to me, you know what? I really think it's time that we sell the land. And I was like, no. And he says to me, okay, so what's your plan? What do you want to do? So I thought, I'm going to tell him my dream of a land trust. So I explained to him my dream of the land trust. And my dad, being the founder of the family trust, said to me, well, do it. If that's your dream, do it. So that's the first opening that I saw from the spiritual world, that I was on the right track. And so I was fortunate enough to be able to be introduced to Cormac Cullinan, who was part of the drafting of the Rights of Mother Earth in South America. And he's a lawyer, an environmental lawyer that's based in Cape Town. And so he assisted me in drafting a land trust deed, which at the time had never been done in South Africa before. And it required a little bit of sort of careful working around the existing law. And we did manage to get into the trust deed, and it was approved by the Registrar of the High Court that we could prohibit the sale of the land in perpetuity.
So let's stop you there just to give you a bit of a breather. And
Okay.
I'm stopping not because it's not flowing,
Mhm.
but I kind of, my sense is you've just in 10 minutes done the history of humanity as we know it in the 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st century, and it's just a staggering amount of. I mean, I was born in 1966, so I was at university with apartheid, Nelson Mandela, and free Nelson Mandela, and have met people who have met him, and that sort of political transformation that we've seen, democracy, but also in the background you've got politics. It's like and then democracy, but then you've also got land and enclosure, and there's sort of the idea of the enclosing it for private value. And what might it be as a common resource, as a commons, and you've got labour, as in what does it actually feel like to be, a labourer, not an owner, not a part of that private capital. And then you've got, well, how might it actually all end up if we could do things sustainably? And what are some of um, the governance, bureaucratic tools that we have to struggle with to bring back some of the commons? And this is a bit of a mind-blowing story because it feels through the narrative of a farmer, it feels like my story, but I've gone a different end. And I was in an airport in New York while I was part of EY, and I had a one-page paper, which was my dream, and I'm still pursuing that dream now, which is very similar. And in fact, a couple of our most esteemed, wonderful advisors and supporters of the project are commoners. There's a guy called Michel Bowens, who's founder of the Peer-to-Peer Foundation, and he's a commoner. Which is, how do we build public good? How do we build and a guy called Guy Standing, who's an economist, a professor, who's a basic income advocate, but he is a commoner. So he's just written a massive book called The Blue Commons, which talks about our oceans as a common resource. And he goes back to talk in an incredibly deep way about something called the Charter of the Forest, which was around the time of the Magna Carta in the United Kingdom, which was actually a legislation to give common people rights over land to eat and sleep and their well-being. And we've forgotten about that, so we've kind of have an atrophy of common good and common land. And you've just touched all of the really quite emotional points there. So I'm kind of out of questions really, but where do you want to go now is my not in life, but with this discussion, what have we not surfaced?
Yeah, I think you've touched on something there that one could maybe just delve into a little bit deeper. When I was working, or when I met with Cormac Cullinan, who drafted the trust deed, he had just at that point released a book called Wild Law. And in that book, for instance, he delves quite deeply into the process of enclosure as it worked out in England. And one of the things that he says there that always, or that made such an impression on me at that point, was that one needs to remember, in terms of modern day law, that the fundamental purpose of just about every system of modern jurisprudence is protection of private rights and property. It has very little, if anything, to do with the common good, and it absolutely has no respect or intent of protecting Mother Earth. Mm-hmm. And therefore, the moment you step out of that jurisprudence, you are waking up, as I said, a dragon that is going to do everything in its might to destroy what you're trying to do, because you're going against the private interests of the most powerful and wealthy people and entities on the planet. And so even though the land trust was already crafted in 2012, I pretty much immediately realized that I was surrounded by people that really had no understanding of what I was talking about. They were like single individuals, Cormac maybe being one of them, my husband being another one. Somehow, intuitively, my father, who didn't really understand anything about what I was talking about, but he, when it came, for instance, to the naming of the trust, I was explaining, or trying to explain to him at the time, why it was that I wanted so much to put the land into a land trust. And I was talking about things like freeing the land from debt, and freeing it from bondage, and freeing it from abuse and extraction and poisoning, and freeing up people's access to the land. And so I was so on and on and on about freeing up. And in Africa, and so the name of the trust, he looked at me, and as the typical editor with the headlines, It was like, the name of this trust is going to be Die Bevryde Grond Trust, which is the freed land trust. He says, you want to free the land up? That's what this is going to do. And so I was really stunned. And to this day, that to me speaks volumes, you know. But
So as we're moving forward, and I just, you probably know this, but in the UK, and I'm not a historian, I'm a geek, as we say, but there's this organisation called the National Trust, and it owns 250,000 hectares of land. It
yeah,
was originally created by wealthy landowners so that common people could enjoy what only rich landowners could historically.
hmm
But with 250,000 hectares, it's rather bureaucratic. To go to the land now, you have to be a paying member, and it's quite a big bureaucratic organisation. And in many ways, it's an enclosure. The trust is a charity. It's got
mm.
many thousands of staff, and so how might your dream manifest? Let's get straight on to the end of how might you
Okay.
protect, because you might get lots of farmers and landowners in South Africa and all over the world going, well, let's do that, and something might, and I'm not saying the National Trust is bad, but it's certainly
Mm.
big and bureaucratic, and many tenant farmers on it, who are the workers, are subjected, maybe to a tenant farmer regime.
Mm.
I don't know anything about
Yeah, it's no different from the feudal system, really.
it.
Yeah. Yeah, so that has been something that has occupied me a lot, especially lately, because in the process, of the last how many years is it now? 12 years. Um, Crafting a relationship between the trust and whoever is using the land has been the single biggest challenge, and then really developing a healthy relationship with sufficient autonomy for the people on the land. And then discovering that when you have a community of people on the land, you immediately have all this potential for human conflict, and when you then in a society, and I must say that now I think globally that is the society. We all have so much trauma around what we as human beings have done to the planet Earth, to each other, that the moment we really try and form community, we first discover that we have to heal ourselves, and the planet. So something that I'm very conscious of, and this brings me to this idea of tokenizing the land, although I still have many questions around it, is I envisage the trust, our trust, the land trust, to really just be a vessel, almost like a bank that holds the title deeds of the land secure. And literally, its chief function is just to make sure that the land does not get sold or bonded or abused or developed inappropriately. It has no other function per se. But obviously, for the land to be productive and healed and regenerated, you need to have community on the land. So it's always been the challenge up until now is how would one achieve that? And
Okay,
so
so
what
let's
has
break it down, just because I know where we're going to, it's going to get more complex. So for listeners who might go, well, Aletta's just gone to Mars and back there. Hold on. So
okay.
so if we break down that first bit, we've got this thing called a trust, which has some trustees and people involved with it, but essentially it owns this land, and it
Mhm.
will prevent this land being sold or abused. That's what it's doing. Now, interestingly, that there are examples of that model that is residing over other property like corporations, where it's doing exactly that, where a trust is owning property to ensure that it can't be sold or abused in any way. So this is we're talking to some high net worth people in Germany who, what is it called, Annabelle?
Steward ownership.
It's called steward ownership, where one of
Yeah.
the models of steward ownership is to separate the ownership
Yeah.
into some charitable and other
Yes.
landlords. There's projects in Scotland that have kind of that first stage that says this thing here, the land, right, never going to be for private capital, never going to be for extraction, never going to be for anything other than regeneration. So if we break down part one of the conversation, I think that's, if I've understood correctly, then that's what you've said in part one. And now
Yes, yeah.
you're talking about the people, the community. Sorry, do you want to come back on that?
No, I just wanted to reiterate that when we started the Land Trust in 2012 in South Africa, that was brand new. But even at the time, they were odd, especially in Europe. There were movements towards that. And in the last decade, more and more of those examples have started popping up pretty much all over the world. With one thing that I have picked up, though, is that often on closer examination, these trusts, these land trusts that have been set up, often do not actually specifically preclude the selling of land. There's always like this little clause somewhere that when the pawpaw hits the fan, you know what, we'll sell the land and everybody will get their due, that participated or that got shares or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, it's a really important point to be very specific about that, not just the language, but what it actually means and how,
And even in South Africa, when we were crafting the deed, Cormac said to me that we cannot, within the current jurisprudence, and that's why I want to come back to the restraints of our Western jurisprudence. I can't speak for Eastern jurisprudence, but Western. And that's mainly, Roman Dutch law and the English law. And South Africa has a combination of those two legal systems. Even in South Africa at the time, we could not achieve it 100%. And so what we could achieve was to say that specifically the land cannot be sold, but we had to make a provision what would happen in the event that the current trust for some reason has to be dissolved or gets banned or whatever. And so the provision that we made is that the land has to be donated to a similar entity with similar objectives. That was as good as we could get it. I would be interested now because, as time goes by, things change, and I'm hopeful that at some point we'll actually get to have a more international jurisprudence that focuses on the protection of natural assets.
And interesting. And so these contracts always legislate against, the need to liquidate because of bankruptcy, criminality, there's this standard list of what the lawyers say. And it's like, in the event of, a nuclear holocaust, what happens to it or whatever. Okay, so we're going to get to the people now on the land.
So the trust has the responsibility to ensure that a process exists by which use of the land can be granted to either individuals or communities or whatever. And so initially, we found that if the trust itself is trying to do that, it is too close to the community in the sense that there was too much of this potential bureaucracy and control and conflict of interest and things like that. So where we've now arrived at, and this is current now, and we haven't even managed to implement that, is to say that there needs to be a third entity that is the intermediate between the trust and the community. So the community would have whatever business form they feel is appropriate for what they're doing on the land. And this intermediate entity would be the one that handles relationships in terms of funding, and if, when, for instance, we get to tokenization, the trading of tokens would be taking place at that level. Any funds that can be obtained to benefit people on the land would come through this third entity and be dispersed to the people on the land. And so there would be a delegation of powers from the trust in terms of managing occupation and use of the land to this third entity. And then there would be a working agreement between this entity and the community on the land. And so we're in the process of crafting that, and the work that we've been doing, or the discussions in the evolution in the transition collective, has really helped to craft that, the necessity of having these three different organizations that are really focusing on different spheres of human activity.
So I've just finished reading a book called Utopia for Realists, which Annabelle bought me for my birthday, which I hadn't read. It's quite a famous book, and it talks about freedom of movement of people. And the obvious question that springs to mind is, to which people, this land, which we're talking about, to which people does it apply? Is it people that have been brought up there who are citizens, or is it anybody? Could I move in and, could I do something?
Yeah, so the ideal for the trust is to have people on the land that have a real heart connection to land, and not specifically that connection. So one of the sort of future ideals of working out of biodynamic agriculture is really to separate the historic use of blood ties and this whole concept of somebody's indigenous to a place, to free people up from that, because there are actually so few people in the world that still has a deep heartfelt need to work on the land, that there should be no barrier in terms of where you come from, or what your background is, or what your genetics are, anything like that, So the trust is being really open around that. And that, of course, makes it also another challenge in South Africa in particular, because the current South Africa, and I'm going to say the current South Africa regime, because it's pretty much an apartheid regime in a different color, is to actually make sure that only people of color, of specific ethnic groupings, have access to land. And so again, not only is the land trust sort of opposing the basic tenets of Western jurisprudence and economics, we now also very much, again, in opposition with what the current situation in South Africa
small
is.
challenges, small challenges.
Yeah, but definitely it is open to anybody that demonstrates that they have that connection to the land.
Yeah, and again, that's quite a tricky one, because the obvious utopia for realists is that freedom of movement, where we don't discriminate one another based on not only the color of our skin or our race or identity, but also where they were born, where they live, what opportunity they might have because they were born in South Africa or London or Palestine or anywhere else in the world. But it's so where you draw the lines on who's in or who's out, it's quite, that third company or organization you've mentioned, that is that's quite a tricky one. But there are not many of them, but successful cooperative ecosystems. The Mondragon in the Basque is the obvious one that that people
Mm.
talk about. So that sort of work in progress in terms of the governor of the community of people that you have on the land. Fantastic.
Yeah.
And then there's a third dimension that I'd wanted to invite you to talk about a bit, which is a tokenization and what that might be about. If you want to talk us through that idea.
Yeah. So one of the things that kind of led me down that road was actually, interesting enough, it came from within in the family. My son, my late son, he's no longer with us, but in the early days of the trust, one of the things, for us to move from a family trust to a land trust, the beneficiaries of the family trust, of which my son was one, had to actually forfeit their potential benefits. So they had to sign away their status as beneficiaries. And so, in effect, saying that they were willing to forfeit their potential inheritance. Now, my son took a leading role because he deeply understood what the future was about. And he was also a computer programmer. And at that time, he was already working with the blockchain, and what is now the DAOs was in the very early stages of development. And he was already grappling with those things. And he was always saying that he would envisage a future in which these technologies would enable people to be free from this concept of needing to make profit out of selling land. And so that stuck with me. And he was as I said, he was the leading grandchild that persuaded his cousins to also sign away their rights. And so we then managed to establish the land trust. And I then explored very deeply this principle that Steiner puts forward about the flow of value. So if you're looking at how do you create value, it starts off with people working on the land, and that then creates a certain value. And then human intelligence starts working on the products and the value that has been created by the labor on the land. So you always, on the one hand, have labor on the land, and on the other hand, intelligence working on the value that's been created. And out of that, you have this capital arising, the surplus, and it's then called capital. And in his view of the future of economics, it is vital then to make sure that this capital continues to flow in an economic cycle, constantly being reinvested in building the human capital, the human social capital, human abilities, because it's the ability to support human abilities, both working on the land and working in the field of intelligence. Or using human creative intelligence. It's those two things that actually is the engine of any economic wealth. And so what's happening when land is being bought and sold is that mostly people with a surplus of capital are they literally kind of pouring capital into buying land, and that capital then becomes fixed in the land. And you can actually see that quite clearly in how the value of land escalates. It's got nothing really to do, the monetary value of land. It's got nothing to do with the intrinsic natural capital value of the land. And without human beings working on the land, you're not actually going to keep that land in production. So it's really like taking money and burying it. And saying, I'm not going to invest that in humans. I'm going to bury it in the soil. And then when I need it, I'm going to sell the land, and then I get the money back. And so I was like, we have to find a way to stop that. So
we're all pirates at heart.
Yeah. So when you take that potential out of the equation, you then sit with the situation that capital needs to go somewhere. And now you're channeling it into the support of people on the land and into the social development of human beings and their, stimulating their creativity, etc. But now we effectively have the situation that land is in private ownership and all this money is buried in the ground. So the question then became to me, how do we get that out? And this is where the concept of the debt to Mother Earth that I've been talking about came to me, is that really human beings have incurred a debt by doing this act of putting money into the soil. And therefore, we need to pay that debt back. So one of the ways in which you can potentially pay that debt back is to actually put money into a token that is linked to a particular piece of land. So as the title deed gets secured in the trust, a token is generated, and people can then buy that token as a what I call an act of practical love, to demonstrate that they're paying this debt in order to free the land up. And that money then becomes free and available to support the actual work on the land.
And just because I'm understanding this for the very first time, so tokens are generated as capital value is surplus capital value is generated from the land by the productive use of it. Is that how you imagine tokens being generated, or?
Well, that is the second step. The initial step is to actually, let's put it this way, we need to extract that capital that has been fixed into the land. Okay, now in the case of the farm that is in the trust already, that was done through a free donation. And of course, that can still happen. But ultimately, you need to make capital available. Now, in the current sort of ecosystem of philanthropy, people are simply just donating money to entities to do whatever they're doing in terms of regeneration, etc. Mm-hmm. But there's no, for me, what is absent in that realm is a consciousness about the fact that money had been fixed into the land, and that this whole process is about liberating that money. So to make that visible, my feeling, and I mean, this is not completely thought out, and we haven't done it yet, so this is just an hypothesis, mm-hmm. But I'm proposing that in order to make that visible, we're saying that once we have land, a title deed secured, that becomes like you have an asset value that can be tokenized because it's secure. Okay, it's like gold in the bank, so to speak. We now have the land in the bank, and we can issue a token that is linked to that land. And then we say to people that have got money that they want to donate or invest or whatever, you can buy this token, and that is a demonstration of the fact that you've paid your debt, not your personal individual debt, but as a token that you are part of the humanity that have done this to Mother Earth. And your demonstration that you're actually aware of it and that you're paying that debt is buying these tokens, which then, as I said, that is then money, fiat currency that comes into this intermediary organization, between the trust and the community. It comes into that entity and then is disbursed to communities on the land for either a universal basic income or the actual regenerative work that needs to be done on the land. And so as the capital comes in, there is the potential for more capital to come in than what one uses on the land, which makes money available to be able to buy more land. And as you buy, to put into the trust, so that one kickstarts a process of enabling land to be brought into the trust that can then generate these NFTs that people can buy to support further work on the land.
So to break it down, because it's there's quite a bit there. We've got a natural resource, the land, and that is going to create surplus, and we want to put the surplus back into the land. The reality is that the land doesn't create that. It's the people, the communities that create that, not the land.
Yeah.
So we need to make sure that the land is regenerated, that the soil's healthy, that the natural environment is not extracted and exploited, which is one part of the model. The other part, in terms of the people part of the model, is to ensure that that value is ploughed back always into, and rather interestingly, that, so again, Guy Standing's work, it gives many examples of this idea of where that capital can come back into the people, that through generational, ploughing back of where natural resources have generated surpluses. How does that go back? So the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world is a Norwegian fund that was set up from licensing offshore fossil fuel drilling in the North Sea. It's the biggest, but rather than giving the money to the government, they set it up a trust, and they put all the proceeds of that back into to then invest for the benefit of the communities who were being supported by that natural environment. And so I think in many ways this is a common, and it's back to the Annabelle's, what she was saying, the German, how do you reinvest the capital back to the natural resources, the resources underneath it, which are the value add is human, but it's actually intergenerational. Normally, it's not just it's not just somebody comes and encloses something and makes money just by enclosing something and having a private property. It's the means of production on top of that generate the money.
It's whether one sustains that potential, both at the level of the land and the human beings.
Yeah. And in fact, the tokenization is, it's the principles of what you're trying to do, I think, have been, people have experimented in playing that out with many different types of governance structure. Now, of course, the idea of doing it on a blockchain is that you could innovate in a way that stock markets are never going to innovate, because it's very much a sort of, the tokenization of a company's assets on a stock exchange are a fairly tried and tested model. But doing that with land and doing it with specific rules like you're talking about is, I guess, where technical innovation may come in.
And it's also got a lot to do with avoiding the pitfall of this separation that happens in most bureaucracies between the actual people on the ground, like I talk about, and the people making the decisions. So one of the things that I feel is that the potential exists through the application of blockchain and DAO technologies to ensure that separation is much more difficult to happen. That if somebody truly wants to participate, that the mechanism exists and it's not going to disintegrate because of human power plays, because you're dealing with a technology that can be that is fixed in the sense that you're not going to lose track of it. Somebody is not going to manipulate.
And at the end of the day, that principle is about participatory democracy. In other words, the people at the bottom get to govern, rather than a separation of ownership with worker, So, worker-owned cooperatives, again, being very specific with my language there, where 100% of the ownership of an organization is divided up into the people who work there, without a separation of governors or owners and workers, is something. It hasn't ruled the world at this point, but there's certainly we need to investigate this sort of this separation, and how we address some of those issues.
And a lot of that depends on really the I call it like spiritual capital of people. How conscious are people? How able are they to really cooperate according to cooperative principles? And a lot of if people are caught up in an economic system where you're really struggling to make ends meet, and all of your energy is about how you're paying the next bill, how you're going to put food on the table, people don't have sufficient capacity to actually evolve their consciousness to understand that cooperation is more beneficial than competition, etc. And so this is where, for me, the necessity is absolutely to find this mechanism to draw this capital that has now kind of escaped either into the soil or into the ethers, to bring that back to support people with a basic income. And I think you experience that with that project of yours, to make sure people have a basic support income, so that the social skills and capacities can develop, that there's enough space, headspace, for people to do the healing, the inner healing, the conflict resolution, to develop skills in communication, in cooperation, all those kinds of things. You cannot do that with people that's in a zone of survival.
No, because it's fight or flight, isn't it? If you're starving, if you're being shot at, if you've got no cognitive surplus to think, well, what might I do to create sustainability here? It's like no time to think. So we've seen that in action. We've seen that where you give people the gift of time, the gift of space, that they pay you back many times over by being able to think things through. My head's all over the place, Aletta, because we've just covered everything so wonderfully. Annabelle, come on, help us.
I'm conscious I haven't said very much, but my head is spinning, and I sort of, one thing that I'd take back to Guy, one big thing that I'd taken from him, having been exposed to him, for a few months and read his book, and is this idea that actually what we have doesn't actually never, or it has always belonged to all of us. It is ours. This is a commons, and we've been through moments in history where we've done stuff, which actually has been done to many people, not willingly done either. And, we're having to live with that history now. So if we, what you're doing and your decision, is in my mind a wonderful thing that actually isn't, shouldn't be a wonderful thing. This is what we should be doing with lots of our stuff. Guy would refer to our libraries, as a commons. This is a common good. This is a tool for enrichment, for people and individuals. And of course, what we're doing is just selling it all off, and you
privatize
the whole of collapsing capitalism. So it's like, creating that moment to think, that cognitive surplus that Rob talks about, is quite crucial, I think. There's a lot of people, lining up now to say everybody needs to start thinking, everybody needs to start doing stuff, everybody needs to be a citizen and stand up and do all this stuff. But that can't happen unless we create the space for people to do it, because we just don't have that cognitive surplus. Everybody is drowning, some people quite literally. So it's amazing. Thank you for sharing your story. I hope it will inspire many others to think about, where they are and what what they what they might do with what they have. But yeah, wow.
I wonder what place some principles or charter or what, back to Guy banging on about the charter of the forest, that a community of people where land is their thing would come together and create a set of principles that actually could articulate for them, what they were living by, in terms of communities or communities of communities, and how that governing document might evolve bottom up, if that makes sense. So you've got the residents, if you like, in the land who over time have got a set of principles that this company, this third organization you've talked about, which is the community one, is kind of administering, but it's bottom up, because actually at the end of the day they've got to live and breathe by a set of something in common. And it back to, I've never read it, or it's written in very old English, but Guy's Charter of the Forest, about what rights and responsibilities, because you can't use a piece of common land and then just empty your litter on it, so there will be the sort of principles encapsulated in some list of principles that people live by.
No, absolutely. And I think that if you look at Eleanor Ostrom's work around the commons, I would say that the principles that she elucidates there pretty much covers, what one's approach needs to be if you want to live in a healthy way on land.
Yeah. Yes.
I would like to just, if I may, say another thing around this concept of putting land in a trust is, one of the biggest fights that are taking place in the world really is around land, and this whole concept of, people having been dispossessed of their land. And for me, there's like a huge error in that logic, because in the first place, nobody ever possesses land. At most, people were embedded in their landscapes, and that potential has been destroyed through the expansion of Western civilization. And so for me, the concept of the land trust is really to highlight the need to take this conflict around land out of the picture. Nobody's going to own the land. It's not a question about who owns the land. Nobody owns the land. And what is your interest in becoming connected to the land, of caring the land, of being a custodian of the land, of serving the land, of demonstrating how we can regain our balance in terms of being a human on land.
Yeah, and it's as ludicrous in that metaphor of ownership as imagining privatization of the air. And of course, we have debates in all the countries about, wouldn't it also be ludicrous to own the water as well? And
it is totally.
Oh my word, we've done that, haven't we? Forgive me. Sorry, we have privatized the water.
Totally. And then we find, like, how do you separate the water from the land? And the moment you do that, you've destroyed the land.
Why would you do that? And so we come across a project in Lebanon where the water is actually not owned by the government. It's not licensed to the people, and it is the community who are looking after the common. It's a common. It's seen as a common asset where it's stewarded by the people in Lebanon. That maybe it's a failed state according to, but we can learn from how they've done water resilience there, as opposed to in the UK where most
we've done so well.
Utterly failing.
We shall swim in the pool. Just awful.
So yeah,
Right.
I love the, who could ever own land? Who could ever own air? Who could ever own water? That, you're not dispossessed of something that you couldn't have owned in the first place. You could get deep connections to it by, working on it, with it, for it. But never try and subjugate land for you to be its master and extract from it. That's a beautiful, maybe finishing point, if that's.
Yes, I'm happy.
I cannot believe it's an hour.
No.
Just like, I feel we need to kind of do another one and do your life story now, because we kind of got to where you are now, and we missed so much of it, I'm sure. But thank you for sharing, Aletta.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.